Okay, so our last unit, our last lecture that has new content in it. So the next lecture after this is the final exam review lecture. So the going forward, there is a Unit J reading on sociable weavers that is out, and then this Canvas assignment that for comprehension of this unit, which will be due this Sunday, and then that's the last of those. Then next week we'll have Tuesday will be our final exam review, and then Wednesday that's when your 10-minute video presentations are due to Canvas. So you just upload those to Canvas. Just some tips here. There is a rubric at the bottom of that assignment where you upload that. Be specific about your hypotheses. Try to keep them narrow, so keep them relatively simple, and that I think will be easier for you, and then it'll be clearer as well in how you're putting things together. You want to motivate by kind of why sort of a human application. Like I mentioned, these are kind of tied to con bio, but after the motivation, it can then just be an organismal talk. It can just be a causal question about, how does this particular animal distribute itself or something like that. And then the hypotheses don't have to reference humans. The hypotheses just have to reference, the potential explanations for what explains that behavior. And then, in your discussion and in your introduction, you'll sort of say why those explanations are relevant to humans if you're thinking about environmental impact of human activities or those sorts of things, but humans don't have to actually be in the hypotheses. So that's kind of what I'm saying here by justifying the with the broader context, connect to the stakeholder action options, and remember to italicize your Latin binomials. So you upload that Wednesday night. It's got a hard deadline of 11:59 so that I can then have the peer review assignments be made, because all the submissions have to be in before the peer review assignments are made. And then those peer review assignments, every one in the class will get one presentation to watch. And then so between basically Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, you'll have an opportunity to watch that 10-minute presentation, fill out a rubric on Canvas, make a few comments, and submit that. And then I'll take a look at all of your responses, your peer review responses, and basically give you a tick if you've filled out the rubric and left some constructive commentary. Then you'll get that fraction, and then those scores may help influence the scores that are given on the actual presentations. And then finals week. So the way we're splitting up the final, Thursday is stage one. Someone will be here Thursday. And for that individual-based exam, if you want to take it here, I plan to open it Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. So you don't have to come here. You can take it remotely. It's Canvas lockdown browser. If you've taken that compliance test, which everybody should at this point, then that final exam module should be open. There is a sample final from last fall that you can take. There are a study guide that's available in there that basically references all the other study guides. So there's resources in that final exam module that you can use. And that's where stage one will be loaded after I build it. So over Thanksgiving break, I'll go ahead and build the exam, and then I'll put them available there. So you take stage one, then you'll have the weekend to not worry about the exam. And then all finals week, I'll open it Monday through Friday, stage two, the collaborative one. Someone will be in here staffing I think it's a Tuesday. I forget what time it is, but it's on the Canvas calendar. So if you want to use this space during that final exam time to do the collaborative stage two, you can, but you don't have to. It's open again Monday through Friday. It's exactly the same as the midterm setup. So individual based with lockdown browser for stage one, collaborative, and open notes for stage two. So any questions about the timeline moving forward? Almost done with the semester. Okay. All right. So, like I said, the last kind of new content we have, which kind of tees things up for those who you're interested in this, can then continue on to take Bio 436, which I think might be offered next semester. So we're talking about social behavior. When people think about social behavior, a lot of times they think about these large displays. This is the starling murmuration. So I've probably seen one of these before, where it's this highly conspicuous pattern of emergent collective motion in these very large numbers of animals, particularly starling flocks, but you see them in other birds as well. And you see versions of it underwater. There's schools of fish that have similar pictures and so on. So it is a beautiful sight. It is an interesting product of nature. But as from a biological perspective, we ask questions like, well, mechanistically, how do these individual behaviors lead to those patterns? A lot of the kind of people on the physics side of biology are particularly interested in that. So if you know a little bit about how the individuals move, then can you somehow predict these large envelopes that form? But from a evolutionary biology perspective and a behavioral ecology perspective, the why question, why do animals behave this way? Who benefits? Is there something special behind these macroscopic patterns that we see, or is it just some emergent coordination? So do we really see cooperation? Do we really see, is this like a big Hero 6 moment where they're all coming together to form some very large structure that has properties that are beyond the properties of the individual? Or are these just individuals going it alone? And because they're going it alone together, then they just happen to produce something that to us looks intentional, but to them is just part of background noise. So that's kind of a question that we would ask here. It's hard to answer that question. I mean, it has been kind of answered in this, but it's hard to directly get at it with a giant group of animals like this. And so there are related questions we can ask about more tractable groups like these. So these are sheep under threat. So this is a slowed down version of the last couple seconds you just saw here. Here you've got, I think, a predator. I think it's like a dog that they've introduced here. And you see something seems to be happening with these sheep when the predator gets close together. They start forming these structures. And so they put these motion trackers on the back of these sheep and tracked them over a bunch of different introductions of these predators. And they got outputs that look a little bit like this. So you've got these sheep that are hanging out, grazing, doing their thing. When the dog gets kind of close enough, you see the sheep snap together into this tight ball. And that tight ball seems to sort of flock around together, running away from this dog. And so what we're going to see, it seems like this behavior, this social behavior, is in response to a predator. And it doesn't seem to be scaring the predator away. So that kind of gives you a hint that there might be an explanation that's less about the big structure and more about what the big structure means to those individuals. And so a better example of this is this other study that did something similar, or was studying the similar sort of thing. As they created, in this case, they were trying to study why seals will often move together in these cohesive groups, somewhat similar to the starling murmurations and somewhat similar to the sheep you saw in the past one there. And so they went into shark-infested waters and they put together fake seals. So they created these seals here that were latched together in these structures. And so these structures looked like this. So you have a bunch of these that are together that are all, and so they can put them in different positions, different relative positions to each other. And they were testing this idea of this hypothetical idea that we're going to talk a little bit more about here in a second, called the selfish herd, which has to do with animals getting close together to reduce the domain of danger around them. So each one of these animals, each one of these fake animals, you could put these together. And so these were these two 5 seal model that they built. So a seal here, 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 and here, those 5 locations, or a 4 seal. And here's what a real seal group that they had, if you look at their positions, is going to be. And what they've these little shapes that are put around it, these are so-called domains of danger. And what's a domain of danger? It's the set of points whose closest seal is the seal in the center of this set. So what we're saying here is that, like, this shape that's surrounding this fake seal here, all of the points in this shape are closer to this seal than any of the other seals. That's a so-called domain of danger. And so a hypothesis that comes out of this selfish herd idea is that animals, when in the presence of predators, prey that are also in the presence of other prey, will attempt to reduce the amount of area around them that effectively becomes like a bigger target on their backs. So the thought is that if a shark was to come at this group, then maybe the seal that has the most distance around it would be kind of the most likely for the random shark attack to hit that seal. So if you get closer to another seal, then if that other seal's got more area around it than you do, then maybe it's more likely that it's kind of like if you're throwing darts at a dartboard, the areas of the dartboard that are larger are more likely to have the darts that hit them. And so this domain of danger, because these are all points closest to that seal, the thought is that if a shark, kind of like a dart, ends up popping up in any of these domains of danger, it's probably going to go after the seal that sort of is the owner of that domain of danger. So how do you minimize your domain of danger? You flock close to other seals to try to make it so that other seals are nearby as well, and you take shelter in other individuals that might be hit instead of you. That's the idea of the kind of selfish herd. And so he tested this idea to say, so they created a bunch of these models where they could create different domain of danger sizes, some that were similar to what you saw in nature, some that might be exaggerated to test this theory. And what did they find? So if you look at the group of, and it turns out that this was an extremely effective experiment. They would float these things out in shark-infested waters off of Australia. They had to stop the experiment early because, like, their version of the Coast Guard kept getting calls because people were freaking out because there were all these sharks that kept coming up and they could see them attacking these dummies. So these sharks were just it drew a lot of sharks out there and they got a lot of data, and they ended up having to stop early because they got enough data, and it apparently was causing a disturbance to have these sort of simulated shark attacks happening. But what they found is if you look at the attacked individuals, these are fake individuals, fake seals in those configurations, the attacked individual had a domain of danger that, if you remember a t-test, you can measure the size of the domain of danger for this group and the size of the domain of danger for this group. And then you can do a t-test to see if the two means are very different from each other. And what they found is there was a statistically significant increase in the domain of danger for attacked individuals. So that seems to be one common property of those that get attacked relative to their nearest neighbors. What's different about them? The attacked individuals end up having larger domains of danger, as predicted. What they also did is they plotted out, like, okay, so let's just plot out the domain of danger against the risk. So for all animals that have a similar domain of danger, how often was that group attacked by a shark? And that's where they've got this line that was fit here. And it's a pretty strong relationship. So shows that if you can manage to get your domain of danger down, you can manage to get your risk of attack down. So that suggests that the selfish herd might also, this is the idea that might be also what's going on in the sheep. When the predator is nearby, you crowd together with other animals. And in the case of the sheep, you're also sort of protecting the one in the middle by accident, because that's the only way that the other one can get to it. In the case of the sharks come from underneath. And so it doesn't really matter about who's on the periphery or not. But the domain of danger seems to matter. And the ones in the middle might actually have a smaller domain of danger just naturally from this. So it suggests, when you look at things like starling murmurations, these movement of these seal configurations, when you look at the sheep, when you look at those starling murmurations, then it suggests that there's not something going on that's cooperative necessarily. It's more kind of an exploitation of other individuals around you. And that was what Bill Hamilton's idea of the selfish herd was, is that predicting the shapes of these patterns based on exploitation. How is it good for you to be near an individual? You're not helping the individual around you, you're actually benefiting from their presence. And so that's the idea of the selfish herd. When individuals reduce their risk by aggregating to use others as potential prey. Question? The domain of danger is the space. If you have multiple individuals, it's the set of points that are closest to any given individual. So if you were to stand in a configuration here, so if you're standing in some formation, then you could look at all the points on the floor and you could measure the distance from the points on the floor to every individual. And you could say, these points on the floor are closer to me. That's my domain of danger. Those points on the floor are closer to you. That's your domain of danger. And so the selfish herd suggests that you will get animals that cluster together that roughly equalize their domain of dangers. And in the process of them trying to minimize their domain of danger, minimize the set of points that potentially would be associated with them. So if they're dartboards that are self-organizing, they're minimizing the size of their pie on that dartboard, so it's less likely for a random dot to hit their region. That's the idea behind the selfish herd. So, and that's what we're saying here. They move around continuously to reduce their domain of danger. And another fancy name we use for the domain of danger is something called a Voronoi cell. So people who work in this area, they use a branch of geometry that talks about how you break up regions of space using something called a Voronoi tessellation. And that's where they got all this math from. That's where they got all this idea from. And so that's why sometimes they'll just call it a Voronoi cell. That is a synonym for the domain of danger in a selfish herd. So, all right, any questions about that? Domain of danger, selfish herd. So it provides a selfish explanation for what might look like an aggregation that maybe has a bigger purpose. And it doesn't mean it doesn't have a bigger purpose, but this seems to be a more parsimonious explanation for why those seals are moving together, why the sheep suddenly snap together when the predator's around, and why those starling murmurations often are so tight when there is a predator that is flying by as well. Okay. So this term selfish, we've seen other versions of this type of exploitation already in the class. So when we talked about these wolf packs, then these wolves tolerate other wolves nearby because they prevent ravens from picking off this food. But the wolves, that doesn't come for free. These wolves that are in these ultra large packs are actually then benefiting from the tremendous effort that one or two wolves to actually take down a really large animal. So they're exploiting the ones that have actually done the work here. Similar to, we saw this bat example where these bats aggregate, and they're not aggregating to be a more effective hunting group. They're aggregating because if you get closer to another bat, you can benefit from that bat's sonar as well. So as that bat has calls, if those calls reflect off and hit you, then you can maybe make an inference about where prey is using the signals emitted by the other bat. Now, they might be benefiting from you too, and that's fine, but it's not like you've come together and paid a cost to come together for the group to do better. That's a very different. So in this case, everything comes together because it's beneficial for the individuals. These are all selfish outcomes. These are group patterns that are the outcome of selfish processes, is what we're trying to sort of say here. And so this is often the case, is that in animal groups, often the case, social groups are structured by exploitation, and that exploitation emerges from positive and negative externalities. And as a reminder, positive externalities are benefits provided to others as a side effect of an act or of a behavior, and negative externalities are costs imposed on others as a side effect of an act. So a positive externality is often called a public good. So if you donate to public radio because you like the programs that are on public radio, there are other people who don't donate who can listen to public radio. You're paying for that public good, that public radio to be there, and others are benefiting. Things that your tax dollars go to pay for that others benefit from, like highways and so on. That's another example where that activity is benefiting others who may not have actually paid in the same amount. So that's a public good. On the other side of it, negative externalities like common pool resources, open access goods, the tragedy of the commons, these are all examples there where your use of a resource benefits you, but by using the resource, you degrade the benefit to someone else. And that's a negative externality. And so these positive externalities, negative externalities often attract animals to come together because the positive externalities, there's benefits there that you can exploit, and the negative externalities, these are maybe costs imposed on others, but they're costs that you don't feel, and so it doesn't cause you to move away from those others. So those structures we can sort of separate out into a table like this, and you can kind of see that this is going to be a 2 by 2 in a second. But we start out here, and we've been focusing on things that always benefit the actor, possibly at a benefit to others or at a cost to others. And so we have names for these things. So if it's a benefit to the actor, but a cost to someone else, then we refer to that as selfishness. So this is like strict selfishness. You could argue, and I'm going to argue in a second, that both of these are technically selfish because they're benefiting the actor. You can explain the behavior without worrying about the recipient because all the benefits are positive for the actor. So it's selfish. But the pure, strictest sense of it, selfishness, is it's a benefit of the actor coming at a cost of another animal. So stealing food, kleptoparasitism, that's an example of it's a selfish behavior. It benefits one at a cost of another. Another option of that is so-called byproduct mutualism. So selfish herds, this is like flocking for personal safety. This is a case that if you're flocking together, you're not actually bringing a predator in, like you're not increasing the danger on others, but you're getting a benefit out of being around others. The human example I like to give is like if you're ever looking for a parking spot, if you watch someone clear a row as you're clearing a parallel row, when you both turn out of that row, you don't turn down each other's rows because you know that that person's already has not found a parking spot. So why would you go and search for a parking spot when you saw that they're the only one in that row and they didn't find one? So you've now benefited from observing their action, but that's a byproduct. You weren't actually going in it to help each other. In fact, you didn't pay any additional costs to get into that interaction. It's just a byproduct. This is different than a true mutualism, where in a mutualism, you actually have the evolution of something that oftentimes provides a codependence, like there's a cost to both, but ends up generating a benefit to both, and the benefit to both is greater than the cost to both, and that's what sustains the mutualism. This is just a byproduct that happens to be mutualistic, but it's not, evolution's not driving the mutualism. So that's what I mean by byproduct mutualism. So in both of these cases, if you observe animals doing selfish herding or observe animals stealing from other animals, in neither of those ways do you have to, there's no puzzle. It's like, oh, I get it. Both of those behaviors are good for the individual. So that's why we might view both of them as being kind of selfish. So both are selfish and they both clearly have a benefit to the actor. So a murmuration looks like a really cool, from a physics perspective, it's a really cool phenomenon. But to an evolutionary biologist, it's kind of boring. It's just a bunch of animals trying to minimize their danger, and it leads to these cool murmurations. That's what I mean by selfish. What's more interesting is kind of what happens down here. Any questions on this half of the chart? Okay, so so there can be other types of behaviors. So one example, your question? Both are selfish because they both can be explained by just viewing the benefit to the actor. So in both cases, the actor is doing an action, like they're flying in a flock, or they're stealing food from another. And even though it's involving others, there's no puzzle because it's clear that it is a net benefit to the actor that's doing it. So it's a behavior that brings benefits to the ones doing the action. If it's one of these other things, like what's going to show up down here, then it's more difficult to understand because if you can't come up with a direct benefit to the actor, then it becomes really puzzling from a biological perspective. Why are you paying a cost to do this thing that doesn't appear to have any benefits for you? These are kind of boring because they both can be explained by obvious benefits to the actor. And so it's interesting that they exist, but there's no puzzle there. Whereas down here, it gets a little more interesting. So, what if we see behaviors that the one who's acting, the one who's providing the behavior, pays a cost, and someone else receives a benefit? So, we refer to that as altruism or sometimes cooperation. And that example of that is sharing food with an unrelated individual. There's no obvious reason why you might share food with an unrelated individual. I bring this up because they've got like that sociable weavers example. If those who read that in the perusal, then in that case, there's a bunch of examples of an unrelated bird coming and feeding the chicks of another pair that again they're not related to. And that paper talks about how that is a puzzle, and in that paper, they end up untangling some of that puzzle, sort of solving some of that puzzle, figuring out how this evolved, this helping behavior, this unrelated helping behavior, that at least superficially appears to be altruism, appears to be a individual helping another at purely a cost to themselves. So that's one way we get these things. Now, on the other side, there's something else that we refer to as spite or altruistic punishment. And actually, how many people have started to watch or seen the series Pluribus on Apple TV, the new one? If you're into behavior, it's a good show to watch. It has a lot of interesting, thought-provoking ideas. And if you're familiar with these frameworks, you can kind of see where the writers came up with them. And so without too many spoilers, it's a show. It's inspired by a book where everyone on Earth, except for about 10 people, get infected with a virus that networks them together, and they act as one collective mind. And then from there, it's about the interactions between that one collective mind and the 10 individuals that still have their independent agency, and all of the interesting behaviors that change in that collective mind. You can see that whoever was writing this thing definitely had a little bit of evolutionary biology in their background, because they kind of use examples that we've seen in nature, and they use things that are inspired by some of these ideas. And so, without spoilers, I want you to just happened to my mind went there, is that one of the things that I think about in this show is different cases of so-called altruistic punishment. So what is altruistic punishment or spite? This is this idea of like punishing cheaters or at risk to oneself. So this is an idea that you notice someone cheating, and it does not affect you that they're cheating, but you go over and you get involved, you punish that cheater. Now you've had to pay the cost of punishing that cheater. You've got into that aggressive interaction with that cheater. You've maybe outed yourself as someone who is a rule follower, whatever. You're paying some cost, and it benefits whoever was on the other side of that cheating. And then why are you doing that? So this is this idea that you're hurting someone else, like the cheater, at cost to yourself. And I said it benefits the other one on the other side of that. It doesn't actually directly benefit them because it's already been done. The cheater's already benefited it. I mean, you might be able to give it back, but it's still, you've now paid a tremendous cost just to make sure someone else pays a cost. And that's so-called spite or altruistic punishment. Paying, paying a cost to yourself in order to make sure that someone else pays a cost. Altruistic punishment. And there's examples of this. There are unrelated ant queens that come together, and they have to, these are fungus growing ants. And so someone has to go out and bring leaves in to feed to their fungus, because the ants actually feed from the fungus. But whoever goes out of the nest when they form these nests together, they pay a tremendous cost to go out of the nest because that's where all the mortality is. And so whoever gets put into that job has to be in that job. If you get them in the lab and you do this, if you have an ant who has been kind of elected to be that seed forager or that leaf forager, if the little tube that goes out to the artificial pool of leaves that you have, if whenever she gets into that tube, you pinch it off and prevent her from leaving, so she has to come back into the nest, other ants that are in the nest, they could themselves leave and try to bring more leaves in. But what has been shown is that they will, as long as the original leaf forager is there, the other ants will refuse to start foraging, even to the point of their own fungus, which they cannot get back. It's like it's a monoculture that once they lose it, it's gone and the colony dies. Their fungus starts to decay and they still do not go and get leaves themselves. Now, if you remove her completely, they immediately go out and start getting leaves. So it is thought that this is a mechanism of punishment to those who don't follow the job that they've sort of been fallen into, because if they don't forage for leaves, then no one else is going to forage for leaves, and the colony, including the one who's supposed to be foraging for leaves, is going to suffer. So that's an example of spite or altruistic punishment. So there's a bunch of neat other examples of this as well. And like I said, if you watch Pluribus, hopefully think about this as you're watching it, and there's some interesting examples there. But we're gonna, these two generally are where, evolutionary biologists are most interested in. We're going to focus for the rest of the day just kind of on this one. But I hope you can see that the reason why these are interesting is that they're where the puzzle is. Like, because immediately it's not clear. It's clear that the actor is paying a cost, but there doesn't appear to be anything compensating the actor for that cost. So one would imagine that selection would have flushed that behavior out, because those not paying that cost would end up capitalizing on that in terms of fitness. And so these seem like low fitness solutions that are staying in the population. And that's what makes them so interesting. And that's why we often direct our focus to these boxes and not those boxes. Question? Was there a question earlier? All right. So like I said, for the rest of today, we're going to focus here on the altruism question. So when we talk about altruism, again, direct benefit to actor, with a direct cost to actor, and with a benefit to a recipient, this is something that models of evolution suggest should very quickly get purged from a population. Because if you have a bunch of cooperators, a bunch of those who are helpers that aren't getting any benefit themselves but are helping others, if they're in a group together, they'll end up getting helped by others. And so it's great as long as everybody's a cooperator. But there will be a mutation and a defector comes into play here. And this defector is going to get help from all of these helpers, but themselves does not provide any help. And that defector then is going to have a fitness advantage, which means very quickly the defectors are going to grow and possibly then, and likely then, take over the population. It's very hard to get a mixture of cooperators and defectors. Usually all you see are all cooperators, but then after mutation, all defectors. At least that's what the theories say. So altruism by itself always raises kind of red flags, because it feels like you're probably missing something. That's what I hope you see in that Sociable Weavers paper, where initially it seems like a puzzle that these unrelated helpers are feeding these chicks. But once they observe the interactions a little bit more, how often that feeding happens, under what conditions that feeding happens, and they observe that, aha, there's actually something else going on here. And you use the altruism as an idea that, now this is worth studying. This is something that I should put effort into looking more deeply into. And the thing you're typically looking for are what we're going to be calling indirect benefits. So usually what's missing here is that you've easily observed the direct costs, but there are indirect benefits that somehow benefit the actor, not immediately, but at some later time or in some other way. And if those indirect benefits outweigh the direct costs, then you can still get the behavior selected for. And that's the idea. So we're going to drill down into that here. Any questions before we get to more specific examples of exactly what I mean there? Okay. That's sort of, you become very cynical. And again, evolutionary biology. I just dropped this cap, and on the way here, I stopped to eat a late lunch, and I was sitting on a bench, and there was a student that walked by, and she dropped her ID, and she was walking, and she was just going, and so I happened to say, "Oh, hey, you just dropped your ID." Somebody else picked up the ID, gave the ID there, and I said, "Look at that altruism." There was, I paid a small cost to benefit someone else at no benefit to myself until I told this story, right? So, like, now that I've told you all that, it's ceased to become altruism. It's very much a Schrodinger's cat type of situation. Is that once you measure it, it disappears. So that's the craziness about indirect benefits. And that also goes, if you think about that Sociable Weavers paper, that's going to be very similar to that. It's that you're not helping to help the chicks, you're actually helping to be observed helping. And that provides you the indirect benefit. All right, so with all that in mind, let's do a clicker, and then we'll drill down into an important framework for thinking about cooperation. All right, so question here is just kind of a vocab thing. What's the best term here for this? So what is it called when an action brings a benefit to the actor at a cost to the recipient? So benefit to actor, cost to the recipient. Is it altruism, selfishness, spite, or byproduct mutualism? So where in that grid did that fit? All right, so it looks like we've got mostly, I'll go ahead and I'll stop here in about 5 seconds. All right, hitting stop now. All right, so it looks like we had 9 for altruism, 61 for selfishness, and 2 for spite. I really don't believe there's that many of you in the room right now, but which also speaks to some of these. But I was looking for selfishness. So that's so just generally speaking, benefit to the actor, cost the recipient, selfish. Okay. All right. So I mentioned, prisoner's dilemma. It doesn't actually occur very well or very much in nature, but we use it as an example to help sort of set up other frameworks that help us better understand things that do happen in nature. So, as a review, the prisoner's dilemma is from an individual's perspective. So, an individual prisoner is that you've got two prisoners who's been caught that are probably accomplices at a crime. They're separated, and they can either rat each other out or they can choose to stay quiet. So cooperation, helping another, is staying quiet, and defection is going alone and ratting the other person out, revealing what the other person did. And the idea here is you could think about how many years of their life are going to be taken away by the prison time. And so if they help each other, there's enough evidence to send them both to prison, but only for 2 years. So they both have 2 years taken off their life. If one of them rats on the other one, then they maybe get out free because a deal will be made. But the person they rat on, who is cooperating, has now 10 years off their life. And then the symmetric case over here. And then if they both rat each other out, then they both kind of like there's not as much benefit, and so now they both have 5 years off. So the idea here is that although it would be great if they could cooperate and live up and be up here, it's because there's so much opportunity for regret. So if you both cooperate, and then one of you decides to defect, then it ends up leading to such a huge cost that it's just safer. It's the so-called Nash equilibrium, the no regret equilibrium here, to just both defect. So if they both defect, even though there is technically a cooperative equilibrium that's better, then at least none of them get this sucker's penalty, the S here. And so they maybe don't get the temptation, they don't get out free, but they at least avoid the 10 years. And that's why it's the so-called Nash equilibrium. So if either player changes strategy by themselves, that player will do worse. That's what makes it a Nash. So this is from the perspective of an individual. Now we're going to flip it to look from the perspective of a gene. So any questions about this, the prisoner's dilemma here, about this setup? All right, so this is years off someone's life. Now, if we were to think about a gene that codes for helping behavior, then there could be alleles for cooperation and for defection, for going alone or for helping. And from a gene's perspective, we can think in terms of fitness. Now, fitness is just copies of a gene. So if you have one allele now, you might have 10 alleles in the future generation. So we can shift the payoffs so that they're in terms of fitness here. So the idea here is that if a cooperative allele meets a cooperative allele, they might both get 8 copies in the next generation. If a cooperative allele meets a defecting allele, the defecting allele will get 10 copies in the next generation, whereas the cooperating allele will just get 1. If 2 defecting alleles meet each other, then they both get 5 copies of themselves into the next generation. So it's exactly the same structure of it's exactly the same prisoner's dilemma, but now we put it in terms of fitness. That's the idea here from a gene's perspective. So this perspective here also makes it look a little bit more like the stag hunt, because now it looks like not years off your life. It looks like food that you get. Fitness is kind of like food, but the difference between this and the stag hunt is that this has a huge temptation to defect. If you make this temptation to defect less than the reward for cooperation, this is a stag hunt. So that's what's really weird about a prisoner's dilemma. There are very few examples in nature where it is that good to screw someone over. Very usually it's better. It's just uniformly better to work together, but there are other reasons why you can't coordinate in order to work together. That's the stag hunt. And so because of that, then people go alone because it ends up just minimizing risk. Here, it's actually just better to go alone because it's so tempting to screw someone else over. And that's just weird and sadistic. And that's why the prisoner's dilemma is this weird case. So it looks a lot like the stag hunt, and that's going to be important here in a second too. All right, so we've got that perspective. So that's the gene's perspective, the perspective on the prisoner's dilemma. So now that we're in the gene's perspective, the evolutionary biologist starts wondering about, well, those alleles are not only in one individual, they might be in other individuals. So what's the probability that that allele will be in another individual? And so that's where we get this notion of relatedness. The probability of two individuals having the same alleles. I have 100% relatedness to myself. I have all the same alleles, but I have 50% relatedness to either of my parents because I have half of the combinations from mom and half of the combinations from dad. I also have I only have half siblings, so this doesn't work. But if I had a full sibling, I would also have half relatedness to them because I have there's a quarter probability through mom plus a quarter probability through dad that I share genes with my full sibling. So there are different ways that you can get to these relatedness numbers. But the farther out someone gets in your family, then the less likely it is for you two to share the same genes. And so that's what we're talking about here. So here we've got two individuals that do not share the same genes or have very, very low probability of it. And let's imagine, well, what if we had individuals that had a non-zero probability of sharing the same genes. Does that change the outcome of this game any? So that's what we're setting up here. We're gonna imagine different values of relatedness and see how it changes this payoff matrix. Any questions about that? Or the easiest thing for us to move to is the clonal case. So now we're going to clone individuals. So now you've got two prisoners who are clones of each other. So they are identical to each other, and we're thinking about they've got alleles for cooperation and defection. And so we have to say what's best for the gene, what's best for the alleles. And so now that they're clones of each other, whatever fitness an allele gets through one individual, the allele in the other individual feels the same fitness. Because from that allele's perspective, it just cares about how many copies are in the next generation. It doesn't care whether they come from individual A or individual B. So what we can do is we can add together all of these rewards to get symmetric rewards in all four boxes. So instead of having 8 and 8, now we have 16 and 16. Instead of having 10 and 1, we have 11 and 11. Instead of having 5 and 5, we have 10 and 10. These are just variables that have this. This is the prisoner's dilemma. We just name these rewards. That T is the reward that a defector gets when paired with a cooperator. It's short for temptation. So this is temptation, temptation to defect, reward for cooperation, punishment for mutual defection, and the sucker's payoff is where those terms come from. So you've got now here only one individual got it. Now both individuals get it, and that's where we get this perspective here. So now, if you look at that, can anybody see? Can anybody guess what's the Nash equilibrium for clones? If two clones come together, do they cooperate or they defect? If you're looking at this payoff matrix. So here, this is the no regret solution when they're not clones. Because here, if you change your position and the other one doesn't, you're going to do worse off. What's that case over here? Right. Well, and if we view it, I mean, I am looking for a cooperation there, and if we look at the numbers, then what we're saying here, whereas here you both got 5. So if you're let's say defecting, and the other defector, if you were, yeah, let's say the other individual is going to stay defecting and you're defecting. If you decide to cooperate, you're worse off because you've gone from 5 to 1. And likewise for the other one. That's the reason why this is the Nash. Well, now this is the Nash because this is the only box where if you decide to stay cooperating and if the other individual decides to stay a cooperator and you decide to switch from cooperation to defection, you do worse. So now the cooperative outcome is the Nash equilibrium. So Nash isn't always bad. It just depends on the payoffs. And when you're clones, then you cooperate with each other. Again, watch Pluribus and think this through. And so, this is also why, like in other movies, like World War Z and whatever, you start noticing that, individuals who were independent, once they're infected with the zombie or whatever, now they're effectively all clones of that zombie organism. And at that point, they start sacrificing each other because it doesn't matter who gets the benefit. As long as someone gets the benefit, the zombie gets the benefit. And so now it becomes Nash optimal to help each other. Questions about that? Is that clear? Once we added relatedness in, then now the solution to the prisoner's dilemma is to cooperate. This is a little bit like payment. If you imagine that that if someone would say, eventually when we meet after our prison sentence, I'm going to pay you for your service, then in that case, you might both decide to cooperate if you both are going to get that receive that payment. So if there was a mob boss or whatever who says, hey, if you both keep your mouth shut, then once you get out of your however many years in prison for both keeping your mouth shut, then I'm going to reward you with a big monetary reward. Well, that's kind of what's happening in this case here. All right. So that's the extreme cases. So total individuals, total clones. Now, in reality, life lives somewhere in between. So relatedness swings from 0 to 1. And so usually relatedness is somewhere in between here. And so there are these critical points. So at some point, relatedness gets high enough where you shift out of this weird prisoner's dilemma where defection is your only option, and you swing into both the hawk dove and the stag hunt, which we've talked about in previous lectures. So depending on how the payoffs are set out, then you might be in a hawk dove or you might be in a stag hunt in this intermediate relatedness zone. And that's kind of interesting. But what we're really focusing on here today is this upper level of relatedness. So at this level of relatedness, then regardless of what's happening down here, you flip into the all cooperate. So at what relatedness is it sufficiently high that you will cooperate with someone who is guaranteed to defect with you? That's basically the idea here. So I'm going to zoom in on that and say, if you know you're facing a defector, so that's this row, and you're deciding on the column, then at what relatedness will it be better for you to cooperate with a defector than defect with a defector? And so if we look at the payment to a cooperator, it's this expression, the sucker's payoff plus the relatedness times the temptation. And if we look at this payoff, it's our list. This is the penalty for mutual defection plus the relatedness times the penalty for mutual defection. So we just need to compare these two, the blue one with the red one. That's what I've got down here. So basically I'm saying at what relatedness will the cooperative benefit be greater than the defective benefit? And so this is the direct fitness, S and P. So this is how much the individual doing the helping act gets. So if they cooperate, they get the sucker's penalty. If they defect, they get the mutual punishment for defection or payment for defection. This other side, this is what we're referring to as the indirect fitness. So this is the fitness share that they get of the recipient. So if this one cooperates, they directly get the sucker's payoff, but the other one gets the temptation to defect, and they get the actor of the helper. The helper here gets our share of it. So if this relatedness is sufficiently high, they'll get quite a bit of indirect payoff. So that's what we refer to as indirect fitness. Direct fitness, indirect fitness. All right, other questions about those terms, direct fitness and indirect fitness? So this is so-called inclusive fitness theory or kin selection. It's when you consider the total fitness component at the gene perspective. So this is a selfish gene perspective. The total fitness component is not just the fitness the individual sees, the direct fitness, but it's the fitness relatives of the individual see through the indirect fitness. And when you add those together, that's the so-called inclusive fitness. Questions about that? Okay. So let's just rearrange that for fun. And so I'm going to group together the indirect components and the direct components. So all I did is I just moved things around so that this is the indirect contribution for helping minus the indirect contribution for defecting. And this is the direct contribution for defecting minus the direct contribution for helping. So when I do that, when I group these things together, then what I see here is that I've got this is the benefit. This is the fitness gained by it's the fitness gained to the recipient of the helping behavior. So that's what I'm measuring here. And this is the fitness lost to the helper. So by splitting these things up, then now I've got this kind of relative contribution. So if you're thinking about whether you're going to help or whatever, this is saying if you help, you're going to the who you're helping is going to gain this much over if you would have defected. And if you instead, and then if you help, you're going to lose this much relative to what would happen if you defected. So if you consider defection as the baseline, this is the extra fitness to the recipient, and this is the extra cost to the helper. And this right here, what just shown here, is what we call Hamilton's rule. RB is greater than C. So the B is the fitness gained for the additional helping behavior, and C is the cost lost as a consequence of the helping behavior, and R is the relatedness to the one who's receiving the benefit of the help. And so what Hamilton thought, Bill Hamilton, same person who did Selfish Herd, suggested that if you find that this is the setup, the inclusive fitness setup, and it is almost no surprise that helping behavior can spread through a population. So, science is all about explaining mysteries. This basically outlines that if this is clear that this is the case, it's almost not worth studying. I mean, it is worth studying for other reasons, but it's like you've now zapped away all of the mystery, and it's no surprise that the individual is helping, because you've shown that the individuals they're helping are so highly related to them that the helping is actually end up effectively helping themselves, or it's the genes helping themselves. So we often refer to this as the selfish gene perspective. I think I may have had that on one of the previous slides, or at least it may be coming up, where we're not focusing on the individual, we're focusing on the gene. And when you focus on the gene, then once you have this to be the case, it kind of explains why the behavior exists. And so this then becomes a new kind of a new lens, where if you see helping behavior when this isn't the case, that becomes a really interesting biological question. If you see helping behavior and this is the case, it becomes kind of an interesting example, but no one's going to spend a lot of money studying it because it's kind of already been explained. So questions about that, Hamilton's rule, RB greater than C. So remember those there. Now there's a generalized version that we often use especially when we're thinking about, I mentioned that social insects have haplodiploidy, so the males only have one chromosome and the females have two. And this makes these relatedness calculations more complicated. And so sometimes it becomes helpful to use a more generalized version of Hamilton's rule, where you consider not just the relatedness to those receiving the benefits, but you separate out also and consider the relatedness to those paying the cost. And so when you're thinking down through how is my behavior affecting my inclusive fitness, then it may be that your behavior's costs are actually primarily felt by an individual that is not yourself. So now you have to consider the relatedness to the individual that is not yourself, and the relatedness to the beneficial, to the whoever's benefiting from your helping behavior, who's not yourself. And so you can separate these two things out. If you just divide RB by RC, you get the previous Hamilton's rule. But now we're just splitting it out so that we've got these two relatedness out here. And then so that's the general form, generalized Hamilton's rule. Okay, any questions about Hamilton's rule? And then we're going to apply it to parent-offspring conflict and see how that works. Okay. Hamilton's rule, yeah. Okay, so I mentioned this parent-offspring conflict example last time, and now I'm going to walk through it a little bit. Oh, by the way, I ended up sort of anticipating, because this is a little bit more mathy, I created a little video short that I shared an additional to this lecture, so it just focuses on this portion there. And then that reminds me that course evaluations are available. I think they'll be available until Thursday night of next week. So it's always nice to have that feedback, so that if you're interested, those course evaluations, you should have received an email about that. If you didn't, I think if you go to the Canvas page in the top left corner, I've got a course evaluations button in the nav bar. You can click that, and that'll take you there. All right, so question here was, you've got these chicks, they're begging for food, and so what parental investment P will be favored by natural selection? How much investment, how much food will the parent provide to these chicks? And when we think about it initially in this problem, we think in terms of raw fitness. And so there is a fitness in terms of number of chicks produced, and there's a cost in terms of number of chicks lost. So the more food you provide the chicks that we see right here, the more of them survive to reproduce themselves. So that's what this blue curve is. So the more milk you give the chicks, the more of them survive. But the more milk you give these chicks, it might mean the less milk you can provide to future chicks. So the more resources you use now, the less resources you can use later. So although you're increasing the survival of your current chicks, you might be reducing the number of chicks you can produce. So we got these two fitness curves, fitness gained and fitness lost by investment in the current chicks that are available. That's what we think of in terms of the parent. Now, when we want to think about Hamilton's rule, we don't want to think about raw fitnesses. We want to think about change in fitnesses for every incremental change in the position of the parent. So just like if you're a prisoner, you have to say, do I want to change my position? If I started in defection, what's the benefit by going to cooperation? So here, if you started in one investment strategy, so I'm providing this much milk, what's the benefit for providing a little bit more milk? And that's like taking the slopes of these lines. And the slopes of those lines, those derivatives, that's the actual B and C that shows up in Hamilton's rule. So here you've got a very sharp slope and a very shallow slope. So the benefit has a higher slope than the cost. And that sort of suggests that there's going to be pressure to invest more in the current offspring. And then back here, you've got a very shallow slope. So any additional investment gives you very little fitness benefit in the current generation, but it does give you an increase in cost in the next generation. So down here, because it's so shallow up here, that slope is probably going to be less than, even when you weight by relatedness, like we're going to see in a second, less than this one. So you'd expect the investment to come back. So there's probably some intermediate investment that is best for the parent that maximizes the distance between these two curves. And it happens to be the point that maximizes the distance between these curves is the point where the slope of the blue curve is equal to the slope of the red curve. It just happens to be that. All right, so if we think about Hamilton's rule, the generalized Hamilton's rule, then this is just saying what I just said there, is that if we know the relatedness benefit, so in this case, we're interested in the benefit to the current offspring and the benefit to the future offspring. So this is the Hamilton's rule expression we're looking for here. We would predict that the parent will choose an investment strategy that ends up making the relatedness to the current offspring times the slope of that line equal to the relatedness of the later offspring times the slope of the red line. Now, they both have the same relatedness when we think of it from the parent's perspective. But once we throw in the offspring, then it gets more interesting, and that's where we get this dishonest begging. So if we look at the parent up here, the parent is half related to its current offspring, but it's also half related to its future offspring. So we would expect that the solution to Hamilton's rule for the parent would be this expression right here, which you can cancel the 0.5s out, and it's just this solution right here. So it is where the two slopes are equal to each other. Remember, B is the slope of that curve, that blue curve, and C is the slope of that red curve. So where the two slopes match, that's where you'd expect the parent to provide the amount of milk. But let's think about the offspring. Offspring is 100% related to themselves, but they're only 50% related to their siblings in the future generation. So an offspring, this is going to be a different balance point than that one up here. So the offspring is going to want the parent to feed them farther. They're going to allow, they effectively, the cost for them has half the slope. So instead of seeing a cost that rises at one rate, they're seeing a cost that rises at a much shallower rate, which means they're going to want more parental investment. These are both Hamilton's rule. but we have different relatedness in this Hamilton's rule than that one, which leads to different solutions. So if we graph that, then this is what I'm graphing over here. I automatically took out the 0.5s. I just canceled them out for the parent one. That way we could just plot a single FB curve. And so, but then we plot two different FC curves. So this is the fitness of the future offspring. And so the parent sees this line up here, but the offspring, the current offspring, they see half of the future offspring. So they see this line down here. And so it turns out that this vertical strategy here, so this point here, this is going to maximize the distance between this line and this line. So at this point here, the slope at this line, that's this slope here, this dashed line is parallel to this line. But over here, this dashed line is parallel to this dashed line. So this parental investment maximizes the distance between this cost here and the blue curve. This parental investment maximizes the distance between this cost and the blue curve. And that's what we've got here. So that suggests that the fitness maximizing strategy for the parent is to feed less than the fitness maximizing strategy for the current offspring. And so that's going to lead to this conflict here when they're in this region. Now, when the parent starts feeding, they're not going to be at conflict. So if the parent is feeding down here, then it's going to be beneficial for the parent to help the offspring. So it's going to be mutually beneficial. So you're going to get an increase in feeding behavior, and it's going to climb and climb and climb until this point right here. At this point, the offspring have a benefit of trying to get the parent to keep feeding them. But the parent's benefit is to resist that. And so this is where the dishonest begging idea comes into play. So this is what we had last time here. Because there's a difference here, let's remember from signaling theory, begging is a signal. A signal should have a benefit to the sender and the receiver. At low feeding levels here, begging is a signal. Begging benefits the parent and the offspring because it's the parent wants the current offspring to survive, and the current offspring want themselves to survive. So if the parent is feeding them way down here, then begging communicates. It can be used by the parent to increase both the parent's fitness, inclusive fitness, and the offspring's inclusive fitness. They're in agreement. So it is a signal down here, benefit to both sender and receiver. The reason we call it a dishonest signal in this region is that between these 2 points, it's actually a cost. It's detrimental to the parent to feed more, even though it's beneficial to the offspring. So this is where we'd expect kind of an arms race, a signaling arms race, where the offspring is going to try to evolve ways to exploit the parent, and the parent is going to try to evolve ways to get truth out of the offspring, because the parent wants to keep things down here and the offspring wants to keep things up here. And that's what I mean by dishonest begging. And we can predict it coming out of looking at Hamilton's rule and thinking carefully about relatedness as we plug it into Hamilton's rule. Questions about that? Okay. Well, that Hamilton's rule is a major tool that you use to study a lot of these social systems, but it's not the only thing that's out there. So there's a bunch of different ways to explain cooperation. Much of the study of social systems is trying to understand cooperation when the direct benefits aren't completely clear. And so, kin selection is what we've basically talked about today. But there's a bunch of other forms of reciprocity and multi-level selection. And these are the types of topics that you would see in Bio 436. And so we've reached kind of the end of what we can cover in animal behavior. But if this types of social systems and why animals help each other and those sorts of things is of interest to you, strongly encourage you to take a look at Bio 436. I think Jennifer Fuel often teaches it. I think Tim Linksfair might be teaching it now, or might have shifted into it. But I think it's a really excellent course if you're interested in these topics. And so go ahead and check that out. Otherwise, that's all I've got for you. So that was all of the new stuff that we had. So we are at the end of animal behavior. So let me give you this last question. And if there's any questions from you, then I'm happy to take them. Otherwise, I'm going to hope you have a good Thanksgiving. So what's Hamilton's rule? Is it RC greater than B, RB greater than C, R greater than BC, R greater than CB? I was not an undergraduate biology student myself. I learned all this kind of in a second life. And so I was assumed all biologists knew Hamilton's rule. And then I end up accidentally insulting a botanist by suggesting like that, that it would be crazy for a biologist not to know RB, well, whatever it is. And I had no idea that, like plant people don't know this stuff. So it's a really important thing. And apparently it's something that now only you know. So there you go. Happy Thanksgiving. Again, feel free to come up if you've got questions. Hi. Uh-huh.
Project. Just wondered if you could read our causal question, just to see